Yes. Okay. I have a problem. If I'm invited to speak, I can just speak forever. So I've written down everything because otherwise it won't be 25 minutes. And I've been asked to start by explaining how I understand the concepts of childhood and youth. Similarly to your starting point, Celia, I do largely approach them as social constructs. I think we all probably know what the dominant definitions of youth and childhood are. So I could give you that definition, 15 to 24, up to 18. I think youth washing as a phenomenon is not about a specific age group, really, because quite a lot of the times the ages of the people are not actually known or they're not mentioned. So I don't think even in this particular context it's that important. And personally, in my own research, I've started increasingly using the phrase young people. I don't speak of children that much because I find it problematic. I used to use it more. So that's kind of a starting point, but certainly the examples I'm looking at, they use these words a lot. They use the words, and that's part of how youth washing works. Okay, so I've talked about youth and childhood. Youth washing. So let's start with the washing part. Basically, it's about actions which have three elements. First of all, they serve the interests of whoever does them. It can be an individual, it can be an institution. Second, they claim to support a marginalized group or a progressive cause. That's youth washing generally. That's washing generally. And third, they don't actually benefit the group or the cause, or they even harm them. So when we talk about youth washing specifically, what we're looking at is the practice of co-opting the participation, voices, or images of young people, and doing this in a way that is self-serving and without actually addressing their concerns. Many actors engage in youth washing, including governments, corporations, international bodies, public authorities, NGOs, and us, researchers. Some of you may be familiar with similar concepts, such as greenwashing, pinkwashing, blue washing, sports washing, health washing, gender washing. There's actually a very long list, and you can see from the words usually what it refers to. And the interesting thing is that there's already a lot of research on all of these other things, but youth washing, even though youth themselves, if you want to use that word, have been using this term for more than 20 years in different contexts, that hasn't been researched. So it's not a new term, it's just something that hasn't been researched that much. So whatever I'm saying today is based on an article that just came out 2 weeks ago. If you're interested, you can scan it, scan the code online, it's free to read. And the article basically sheds light on the mechanisms of youth washing and the interests and the ideologies that drive it and its impact on young people. And so far, this term has been used, but it's mostly been used to criticize the way in which polluting companies use youth washing while damaging our planet. So it's probably not a coincidence that most of the criticism has focused on climate youth washing because polluting companies are not popular. So it's important to criticize, but it's not the most challenging context. And the article does discuss this context, but it also highlights many other examples of youth washing that include human rights campaigns, which is what I will be focusing on, academic studies, consumer research, marketing, and representation bodies such as student councils, youth parliaments, and youth assemblies. One of my main arguments is that child rights, the language of child rights, is often used as a tool of youth washing. So progressive bodies, such as human rights organizations, are in fact also guilty of youth washing. And I show this through 3 examples. And all of them mostly focus on young people from racially minoritized and socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, which is also important. So the first example has to do with abolitionists of child labor, or what they call child labor. The second example has to do with human rights NGOs that report on child political prisoners. And the third focuses on a legal principle that is known as the child's right to be heard. So let's start with the first example, which has to do with child labor abolitionists. I'll provide some context because I don't know how familiar everyone is with this topic. There's a huge body of literature, actually, that criticizes efforts to ban child labor. And these scholars argue that this ban risks depriving children of essential income without actually addressing the socioeconomic reasons that drove them to work. In some cases, laws and policies that seek to remove children from the workforce have also been found to push them into more dangerous and lower paid work. Also, work isn't necessarily harmful to the young people we define as children. In fact, well-regulated and non-exploitative work can benefit them socially and psychologically, and this includes teaching them valuable knowledge and skills that are not provided in school. And in some cases, work also provides children with the means to pay for school fees, school uniforms, and school meals. I'm saying all of this as someone who, by the way, worked as a child for a living, not necessarily in those contexts, but speaking from personal experience. In other words, work and education are not mutually exclusive. Actually, school attendance and schoolwork might be considered a form of unpaid and compulsory labor. That's actually a feminist lesson. And this labor is sometimes accompanied by violence because many students around the world are verbally or physically abused either by other students or by their teachers in some cases. Another problem is that campaigns to remove children from the workforce sometimes serve ulterior motives, and this includes eliminating young competitors in the labor force and securing donations to human rights organizations. So it's complicated. Now, similar criticisms to all the ones I've just mentioned have been expressed by working children themselves. And there are movements of working children across Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, and South Africa, and South Asia. Sorry, there's quite a lot of literature on this, including several books. Over the past few decades, these movements have issued multiple declarations, and they demand acknowledgement of the value and validity of their work. They denounce anyone who ignores their reality. So here's a recent statement known as the Kigali Declaration. It was formulated 2 years ago by young representatives of working children from 16 countries. And it states, you can see the quote, "We do not want to stop all forms of child work. We want adults to act on what we say. In addition, we want to play a role in shaping and monitoring laws, policies, and programs to increase proper implementation so they become sensitive to our realities, situations, needs, and aspirations." But the ILO, the International Labour Organization, doesn't allow these movements of working children to attend conferences on child labor. And it also doesn't consult with them. And this exclusion of working children who express inconvenient views isn't a coincidence. It's actually a deliberate act. For example, a member of the International Labour Organization's committee responsible for drafting treaties and recommendations, once said that we should all ignore those who talk of children's rights words. Very rarely, working children's movements do manage to change laws and policies in their countries. But then they face backlash from powerful abolitionists of child labor. For example, a few years ago, the Bolivian movement of working children temporarily convinced their government to lower the minimum working age and to focus on improving the regulation of children's work. But the ILO responded by criticizing Bolivia, and the European Parliament considered canceling Bolivia's right to reduced tariffs. Then representatives of the Bolivian working children's movement tried to explain to the ILO the rationale behind the reform, but it completely ignored their arguments. Now, importantly, child labor abolitionists don't just ignore these working children. They also use youth washing to maintain legitimacy for their campaigns. For example, they sometimes invite children to their events, but only for the purpose of watching them dance or sing. A few children are selected to speak, but usually they are chosen because they share the views of the campaigners. In some cases, these young speakers have never personally worked for a living, and they live in high-income countries. In other words, they don't actually represent the children whose work is being targeted. Some young speakers were involved in work, but often they are wrongly described as speaking for most, if not all, working children. Sometimes the campaigners describe them in this misleading way, and sometimes it's the young speakers themselves who make these claims. Here's one example, which appears on the website of UNICEF, the UN agency responsible for providing humanitarian aid to children. So their website features the following quote from a 17-year-old Brazilian. This is the quote: "My childhood was interrupted by child labor. I'm grateful to UNICEF and other institutions that take children out of work. But this is not only about me. I'm fighting for my rights and that of millions of other children." In other words, we're told that this young person speaks for working children around the world. Obviously, this is not true or not accurate. So child labor abolitionists don't just ignore young people who disagree with them. Instead, they involve young individuals, but they do this in selective, superficial, self-interested, and sometimes misleading ways. And they also deny young people any real influence on the decisions being made. What this means is that the participation of the young has mostly been an exercise in youth washing. So that was the first example. Here's the second one, which has to do with youth washing and the use of principles of child rights by NGOs that report on Palestinian child prisoners. Every year, Israel imprisons hundreds of Palestinians below the age of 18 for ideologically motivated acts, such as throwing stones at Israeli soldiers. Most of these Palestinians are 16 and 17-year-old, although in some cases they are as young as 12. Now, in the past, these young Palestinians were usually imprisoned with adult Palestinian political prisoners, and this attracted a lot of criticism from international and local human rights organizations, including UN bodies. Following this criticism, Israel increasingly separated the two age groups, but this separation has been harmful to the young Palestinians. In the past, the adult political prisoners offered them emotional support, material care, and educational services, none of which is provided by the Israeli authorities. Surprise, surprise. And these Palestinian adults also helped resolve conflicts among the children, if you want to use that word, and they expressed their concerns to the prison authorities. In this way, the adult political prisoners effectively acted as surrogate parents, especially because Palestinians in Israeli prisons rarely receive family visits. Also, now that these Palestinian adults are no longer nearby, the children are more vulnerable to abuse by the Israeli prison authorities. And we know from many testimonies of Palestinian children, I use the word children just to simplify now, testimonies of children who were held in Israeli prisons, we know that many of them were abused by the Israeli officers. So in this way, the legal norm that requires separating children in prisons ended up making Palestinian children more vulnerable. Now, importantly, all of this was bad. Testimonies of Palestinian children, and again, I'm using children just to shorten here, consistently confirm all of this. They describe the presence of Palestinian adults in Israeli prisons in a positive way. Two of these testimonies appear in a book that was published in association with the NGO Defense for Children International. The authors quote one Palestinian child as saying, this quote, "The adult detainees helped me a lot. They developed my character and I benefited from their experience of culture and life. They made me feel comfortable. Without their support, I would have been lost in prison." Another Palestinian child provided the authors with a similarly positive account. He said, "The children lived with adults who took a lot of care of us. Support was strong and detainees discussed their problems. I am still in touch with friends I made in prison, even though they're much older than me." Interestingly, despite these positive descriptions, the author warned us being detained with adult prisoners could push a child to behave more like an adult. In this way, the authors prioritize an abstract conception of childhood over the actual circumstances of the children they claim to serve. Here's one last example, which was published by an NGO called B'Tselem. It is titled 12-Year-Old Beaten and Imprisoned with Adults. Okay, that's the title, Imprisoned with Adults. Now, since the NGO usually uses this type of titles to highlight problems, we would expect a negative description of imprisonment with Palestinian adults, but the boy actually says that these adults provided him and his friend considerable support. This is what he said. "The detainees treated us well. They gave us candy, chocolate, and potato chips. I felt comfortable. A detainee helped me ask for the doctor to treat my leg. The adult detainees took care of me because I was the youngest detainee in the department." So as we can see, these NGOs don't simply ignore inconvenient views. Instead, they quote them, right? This is all from the NGO reports. And in this way, their reports seem more reliable because they are based on what children say. So it's not just adults speaking. But actually, the NGOs are pushing an agenda that goes against the testimonies they themselves are quoting, right? They are quoting children that say that separation is problematic, but then they criticize the lack of separation. They push for separation. Okay, so these NGOs like child labor abolitionists link to conventional wisdom about childhood. Their disregard of the young people who are affected by their policy is another example of youth washing. In both examples, seemingly progressive principles of child rights enable human rights actors to pursue their agendas while misrepresenting or selectively engaging or disregarding the young people who are affected by their actions. So now let's look at the last example, which focuses on another principle of child rights called the right of the child to be heard. Often we are told that this is the solution. Over the last 4 decades, the idea that children have a right to be heard has become central to policies, laws, and debates about them. The main legal instrument, I'm supposed to be a lawyer, so I'm referring to the law. I'm not your average lawyer, hopefully, but the main legal instrument that enshrines this right is the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC, which is also the most widely ratified treaty in human history. Article 12 of the CRC is the article specifically that enshrines this right, the right to be heard. Article 12 has received a lot of praise from child rights advocates. For example, one scholar argues that it has transformed the status of the child to one of active participation and agency. Another scholar says that the article sits at the center of research, advocacy, and policy focused on the importance of child voice and participation. Interestingly, youth washers also love this article. So they often cite the child's right to be heard, including Article 12. And this includes child labor abolitionists, who often claim to be operating on the basis of this article, and also NGOs that report on Palestinian children in Israeli prisons. So you can see this article being mentioned in those reports. They engage in youth washing while claiming to promote the views, the voices, and the participation of children. Now, a large part of what makes the child's right to be heard so useful for youth washers is its vague, discretionary, and exclusionary nature. Let's look at the wording of Article 12, and you can see why. I'm quoting the article. State parties shall assure to the child who is capable of forming his or her own views the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child, the views of the child being given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity of the child. So as you can see, I've highlighted certain parts here. Article 12 allows decision makers to ignore any child if they decide that the child's views are not his or her own. Interestingly, there's no similar legal limitation on adults, even though they can also be influenced by other people. Article 12 also allows to exclude children if it's believed that the issue doesn't significantly affect them. So that's another way they can be ignored. And even the children who are heard can easily be dismissed because of the requirement to give their perspectives due weight based on their age and maturity. This vague wording enables decision makers to ignore children they disagree with by labeling them too young or immature. I usually tell my students that this is the right of adults to decide if and how to listen to children. This is really what this right is about. So when are decision makers likely to act on children's views? Several studies have found that this is often far more likely to happen if those views are similar to their own views, or if the child is already almost an adult, legally speaking. In this way, Article 12 contributes to youth washing. It gives decision makers a lot of discretion to decide which children are heard, on which issues, and whether these children can influence the decision. In other words, youth washing isn't simply a violation of the child's right to be heard. Instead, it is made possible by the discretionary, vague, and exclusionary wording of this right. So as I mentioned earlier, the issue of youth washing has received limited academic attention so far, and almost entirely in relation to climate youth washing. But as I hope we've seen, this practice easily lends itself to many agendas, including supposedly progressive principles of child rights. And I'm focusing on them because I think they are less obvious. The concept of youth washing helps expose and problematize the way in which young people are used, co-opted, especially in contexts that involve groups that are socioeconomically disadvantaged and racially minoritized. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.